So welcome to the seminar series for the Center for Research on Computation and Society, which you may hear in its fun acronym form as CRCS. Today, we are so honored to have Professor Catherine D'Ignazio with us. And if I can find my cursor, here we go. I'd like to highlight that this is the second in a series of 4 awesome talks this semester. So stay tuned for these talks later in October. And actually, stay tuned because Professor Beery might be a week later than it says there. So just please keep an eye out for those emails. And with that, I have a fairly long intro per Professor D'Ignazio. Usually I condense them, but it is so cool that I want to say as much as possible, and this also gives people some time to find the room. So it's my pleasure to welcome Professor D'Ignazio from the Urban Science and Planning Department at MIT. Professor D'Ignazio is also director of the Data and Feminism Lab, which uses data and computational methods to work towards gender and racial justice, particularly in relation to space and place. Professor D'Ignazio is many things: a scholar, an artist designer, and a hacker mama who focuses on feminist technology, data literacy, and civic engagement. That's what I really wanted to be able to say today. She has run reproductive justice hackathons, designed global news recommendation systems, and created talking and tweeting water quality sculptures. She co-built the platform databasic.io, a suite of tools and activities to introduce newcomers to data science. Her book, Data Feminism, charts a course for more ethical and empowering data science practices. Since 2019, Professor D'Ignazio has co-organized Data Against Feminicide, a participatory action research design project. Her forthcoming book, Counting Feminicide, Counting Feminicide, Data Feminism in Action, which is coming out in 2024. Yes? Highlights how mainstream data science can learn a lot from the care and memory work of grassroots feminist activists across the Americas. Can we please get a round of applause in welcoming Professor D'Ignazio?
Can you all hear me okay? Is that picking up? Yeah? I just want to say one of the future guest speakers is here. Tawana Dillahunt. Yeah, sure. Great. All right. Awesome. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out in the rain. I really appreciate it. It was really coming down this morning. I want to just thank Esther. I want to thank CRCS, which I just learned right now is the way that you pronounce the CRCS. Really appreciate that as an acronym. It's a real honor to be speaking with you today, to be invited to be part of the lecture series, to be in this amazing building also. Yeah. Sure. Oh, with Zoom. Yeah, it doesn't. look like it is.
Yeah. Okay, so it's there. Cool.
Yeah, great. Okay, great. All right, so today I'm mainly going to be talking about the urgency of participatory processes when we're thinking about how to create artificial intelligence, machine learning systems, and other kinds of data-driven technologies. So first, I want to thank the Wampanoag Nation and the Massachusetts peoples on whose land I'm a guest, and on whose lands I completed most of the work that I'm going to be talking with you all about today. The land acknowledgement that you see here is very simple, and part of that is because the institution where I work, which is MIT, we actually don't have an official land acknowledgement because we have not done the work to build relationships with Native and Indigenous peoples of the area. And so that's something that we are working on. There's a number of us, a growing number of voices that are trying to work towards something like that at the institutional scale. We are also working to hire more Indigenous faculty and admit and support more Native students. So I want to start with a bit of reflection for our current moment in data justice. So there have been some really important works in the past decade in particular, like the field of what you might call critical data studies or AI ethics or data ethics is, I would say, bursting with these kinds of works. These are, for me, some of my favorites. These are works that have named and theorized and advanced really important concepts that describe the harmful and discriminatory effects of data and artificial intelligence. And so these are concepts like surveillance capitalism, the new Jim Code, automated inequality, data extractivism, data colonialism, and data justice itself. So I think these works, and if you haven't read them, these are all works that are quickly becoming classics in this space. And so if you haven't read these books, I would really encourage you to read them. They show very convincingly how our data sets, our data systems, algorithms, and AI are accelerating and exacerbating long-standing, durable social inequalities, such as racism, sexism, colonialism, and more. And so what these works teach us is that data and AI are not outside of power or politics. They are not separate from that realm. In fact, power is increasingly concentrated and wielded through data systems. And especially when we start to think about how AI is permeating all levels of the public and private sector. So being used to allocate public services, to allocate medical services, grant loans, access to education, to housing, to food, and more. And so I want to just pause for a second on this, just to bring up something we've been thinking about in a project that we're working on right now about housing and technology. So the housing sector is experiencing the integration of a whole host of different technologies. So many of these are powered by AI, data, algorithms, predictive modeling, and so on. But if you look across the various products that exist in this sector, at least in the United States, you can look and see for whom these products are being built. And then we can ask, I think a very simple question, which has a more complicated answer, but it's a simple question, which is, why are we building systems that concentrate power in the hands of people who already have power? People who already have the upper hand in a housing situation are landlords and property owners. People who don't have the upper hand in a housing situation are tenants and prospective tenants. And so why, for example, do landlords have so much more data, algorithms, and AI on their side? So we've ended up with this increasingly dizzying array of what's called prop tech. These are some examples of that. So PropTech stands for property technology. These are some examples of what you can see there. So landlords can do background checks on tenants. They can know about their criminal and eviction records. They can know about their credit scores. They have access to an amazing amount of data about their prospective tenants, whereas tenants know very little about landlords and have access to very little. They don't know whether their landlord is a serial evictor. They don't know whether their landlord is good at fixing things that are broken in the apartment, for example. And so where are the technologies and the prediction systems that help tenants build power, and why are we not building those? So it's like kind of a very basic question. And I would say, like, if we look across other sectors where technologies are being deployed, we will see the same pattern repeated over and over again, which is we are building tools and techniques and systems that concentrate power in the hands of people who already have it. And in fact, some of these technologies, and when we're talking about housing, prop tech, some of these are not only kind of giving landlords kind of an upper hand, sort of making an asymmetrical information situation even more asymmetrical, but in fact, some of these technologies are actively discriminating against and excluding tenants. So something I'm really proud of recently, and I was really more of a collaborator on this, it was led by Wan-Young So and Anisha Gade, who are PhD students in my department. We worked together on a comment to the FTC about tenant screening services. So these are services that provide background checks to landlords. They look at evictions, criminal records, and credit scores. And often they score prospective tenants on their predicted ability to pay rent. And so one of the things that we show is that these services demonstrate significant racial discrimination, and they also exclude low-income tenants from housing. And the evidence against them is so egregious, in fact, that we propose a federal moratorium on these technologies until companies can prove safety. So we don't just like willy-nilly, randomly, just because we can do something, send it out into the world and see what happens. We actually first look at who is going to be harmed by these technologies. And so I want to include this in a talk where I'm mostly going to be actually talking about design and creating technology, because I want us to remember that refusal is always an option, right? So just because a system can be built, and just because somebody will pay for it out there, doesn't make it ethical. It doesn't make it something that should be done, right? I think there are some technologies, and this is a good example of them, that we need to walk away from, that we need to refuse to build, that we need to develop policy and regulations against, and if it comes to it, that we need to protest and completely shut down. Because why? Because they are causing harm and violence and exclusion, and they're scaling that. It's on a really massive scale, and because that is the power of these systems, right? So tenant screening services is one of these kinds of examples. This can all feel pretty overwhelming, and it certainly does to me sometimes. You know, I'm a person who came up as a software developer. I have a passion for building technology, for designing things, for making things and serving people, and in particular to do those things in the service of justice. But it can feel hard to think about how do we take action, what is the ethical way to do anything in this space amidst this sort of social and political and economic complexity. So if you're a data scientist, or you're an engineer, or a computer scientist, or technology designer who's interested in building a more just world, how do you navigate this? And I want to say here, there's a lot of emerging work in this space. There's actually so much work that's emerging in AI ethics. You know, I think there have been literature scans that there's 100 different lists of AI ethical principles. That itself can be complex to navigate. But for this talk, I want to propose two kind of very basic things, and then just focus on those for the rest of this time. So the first thing is this. The first thing is to work with a framework that robustly theorizes power and inequality. And this is another, I would say, encouraging thing that's happening right now. So alternative frameworks to data science and AI have been developed and put into practice. And there are more of these emerging all the time. So these are approaches that mobilize very robust theories of inequality, while they engage with data. They've drawn from feminist, indigenous, Black, queer, decolonial, and other kinds of alternate epistemologies, alternate value systems, cosmovisions, imaginaries of why we work with data, who is it for, who is it serving, and who should be served. So why is this important? For one, I think the time for being surprised by racism and sexism when it surfaces in our training data or our algorithms or our models, the time for being surprised by that is over, right? We live in racist, sexist, and colonial societies. The default setting for all of our information systems, all of our data sets, is that they will reproduce those inequalities. It's just a baseline. We have to accept that that's true. It is very predictable that that will happen. And so it's more important, the more important thing is how we can think about engaging in root cause analysis to help us understand our information systems and their inevitable biases, to anticipate and mitigate dimensions of bias in our data sets. And so in this group of things is where I would situate Lauren Klein and I's 2020 book, Data Feminism. And so in this book, we looked at intersectional feminist theory, along with looking at the already existing data practices of activists, citizens, journalists, artists, and social movements. And we formulated 7 principles for doing data science in a feminist way. And in fact, one of our main reasons for writing Data Feminism, one of the reasons Lauren and I initially came together, is that we were really frustrated, and we continue to be frustrated, with how these systems and the biases and discrimination reported on by these systems in these systems is reported on by the popular press, which is always sort of throwing up its hands in shock and surprise that like a soap dispenser could be racist or a CV screening algorithm would be sexist. So if you're coming from feminist theory or really from any field that has a robust theory of inequality, this is not a surprise. Again, it's completely predictable. We know this already. So let's stop being surprised about it, right? Okay, and so second, so robust theory of inequality and power. Secondly, this is what I'll mostly talk about today, is to learn how to build authentic, mutually beneficial participatory processes into complex systems development. So y'all may have heard from my bio, I'm in an urban planning department. And while in urban planning, we don't always get community participation right. That's something to put out there first. But we do have a very long history as a discipline of engaging with communities and engaging in participatory design with communities. It's the subject of theory in urban planning, empirical research, and much applied work that seeks to evaluate different models of participation. This is a whole area of inquiry, as it also is, I want to say, in the field of participatory design for anyone who follows that field as well. And so why? Why is that so important? At least in urban planning, it's because we recognize that urban planners can't sit in ivory towers and build complex systems that work for everybody, right? We can't just sit at City Hall and be like, oh, we're going to redesign the transportation system and not ask anybody about it, Okay, so what does an authentic, mutually beneficial participatory process look like for AI and machine learning systems? That's where I'm going to focus for the rest of this talk. So the case study I'm talking about is coming out of my book. It's called Counting Feminicide. It's coming out in 2024, as Esther said. And sort of broadly speaking in this book, it documents the creative, intellectual, and emotional labor of feminicide data activists across the Americas. And so what they are doing, which I'll explain a little bit more in just a second, but this is a kind of increasingly prevalent form of grassroots data science. It's being undertaken by many types of people. It's being undertaken by academics, by journalists, by activists proper, by nonprofits, individuals, mothers, sisters, aunties, families, all of whom painstakingly document cases of fatal gender-related violence, and then they use those data for a variety of political demands and impacts. So just to explain a little bit more about what is this work and what does this entail. So my first encounter with feminicide data activists was when we were writing Data Feminism. We wrote a little bit about the work of Maria Salguero, who you see here. She monitors feminicide in Mexico. So feminicide, for those of you, this is not a common word in English, actually. So I've even had students be told by the Writing Center at MIT that that word doesn't exist in English. It does exist, but we just don't tend to use it as much as those folks in Latin America. Feminicide is a feminist concept. It names the gender-related killings of women and girls. It includes cisgender and transgender women. It is legally defined as a crime in almost all Latin American countries. So almost all Latin American countries have laws on the books defining and describing what this is and having measures to deal with it. However, despite all of these laws and despite this kind of formal recognition by the state does not systematically collect data on feminicide. And so this is the subject of emerging public anger in Latin America, more than anywhere else, also here, but a little bit less so. The Latin American feminist movements right now are super strong. And it's because of the way in which the state neglects to fully implement its own laws and provisions. So frustrated by the lack of action, as well as just the lack of information, Maria Salguero stepped in and decided to collect this information herself. And she's been doing this for an impressively long time, since 2016. And in doing so, she has single-handedly compiled the largest public archive of feminicide in Mexico. The way that she does this is she spends 2 to 4 hours a day reading news articles about violence, about fatal violence. And then logging those in her database and then on her Google map that you can see here. So you can sort of briefly put yourself in the shoes of somebody who's spending 2 to 4 hours a day reading these really horrible stories of brutal violence. And know that then that takes a toll. It takes an emotional toll and a mental toll. And in fact, she's talked about how she needs to take breaks for her own mental health in doing this work. But then using her map and her information, she's helped families locate loved ones. She's provided data to journalists and to NGOs. And she's actually been called to testify in front of Mexico's Congress multiple times. And so I discuss Maria's work, and in Data Feminism, we talk about it as a practice of counter data production, a kind of activist data production that steps in when the state and other institutions are systematically failing to ensure the basic human rights of their people. And so one of the things I learned between the writing of Data Feminism and then this new book is that while Maria's work has received a ton of media attention, this is actually an increasingly prevalent form of data activism, and it's also a transnational form of data activism. There are many observatories. What that means is these grassroots efforts that produce data about feminicide in an ongoing way. Their job is to monitor, to keep the monitor going. It's not just a kind of time-defined research project. They monitor in an ongoing way and to document these human rights violations. And so our collaborative research team, which I'll talk about more in a second, we have a running catalog of just all the different projects we've encountered. We currently have more than 180 projects on that list. Most of these groups monitor feminicide, and they use that frame, that word, or femicide. But others have other names or more specific categories of violence. So folks here in this audience may have heard of the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people in the United States, fatal transgender violence, or some groups monitor Black women killed in police violence. So I want to take a moment, again, and just call your attention to what this means to produce counter data. This means that these very small groups, for the most part, very not well-resourced groups, are trying to count feminicide, literally case by case. They're doing case documentation work, person by person. The typical pattern is that they seek out official information. They go to governments and institutions trying to find official records. They find very little. Or they find very scanty or neglected or sometimes manipulated data, depending on the context. And then, in fact, they turn to news media and social media to find these cases. So then they scour news articles every day, copy and paste from news articles into spreadsheets. It's like super manual, like copy paste. What's the age? What's the method? What's the place? What's the name? It's time consuming. It's difficult emotionally and spiritually. And it's made even more difficult, this work, because the ways in which their primary source reports on this kind of violence, the media, often reports on gender-related violence in ways that are sexist, misogynist, racist, and transphobic. In this chart here, you can see this is the timeline of when these groups have started. And you can see that it's really proliferated in the past 2 decades. There are some groups around who just monitored for decades. But then in particular, since 2015, in Argentina, there was the Ni Una Menos uprising. And since then, this as a kind of a form of citizen data science or citizen data activism has really sort of proliferated as these groups have started to also meet each other and share strategies and tactics.
Quick question.
Yeah, go for it.
The last 3 years, it seems like there's a decline. Is there a reason for that?
I'm not sure about that. I would never consider this comprehensive because it's not like we've equally scanned the entire world. So I don't know how to explain that. I don't know if that means that it's decreasing or just that all the groups that were going to start after Ni Una Menos have now started. And so there aren't other people who are kind of picking up the mantle, or it's just that we don't know about the more recent groups because they might not have as much of a web presence and so on. So, yeah. So I keep referring to our research project. So I want to explain who are we and how did our collaboration come about. So I was living in Argentina in 2019. I was revising data feminism. I had become so interested in Maria Salguero's work, and so I was asking around just to see if anybody else in Argentina and Buenos Aires was working on feminicide and data, if that was a conversation that was being had, and it was in a way that beyond what I could have ever imagined. And I met these folks that you see here. They've now become collaborators and friends on this sort of rather sprawling participatory action research and participatory design project that has now been going on for about 4 years. And so it's with Elena Suarez Val, who she herself is an activist and leads Feminicidio Uruguay. So she does the work that Maria does, but for the country of Uruguay. Silvana Fumega is the head of the Latin American, or she was at the time, she's now left and she's a consultant, but she was the research director for the Latin American Initiative for Open Data. She's done some amazing work on developing a data standard for governments to collect feminicide data. And then Isadora Cruzen is previously started with us as a student. She graduated and she now leads a really significant part of this project working with Brazilian activists. And she herself is from Brazil. And I just want to take the time to acknowledge, we don't always see, who's behind the scenes in these large research projects. There are a lot of people behind the scenes from my own lab, from partners, from Ilda, who remains a huge partner on this project. So just a moment to sort of recognize that it's not just 4 people that do this work, it's like 30. So what is this? The project has these 3 pillars. So first of all, it's a qualitative research project where we want to understand activist data and information practices. Why are they collecting feminicide data? What do they do with their data? How do they store their data? What are some of the informatic challenges that they face? It's secondly a participatory design project so that we might design digital and AI-driven tools to support their work. And then finally, it's a global community of practice. So every year we host at least 1, if not more, events for people to transnationally come together in multiple languages. We always have live interpretation so that people can meet each other across national and language sort of barriers. And then just one thing I want to say, because it's often misunderstood with our name, we do not collect any data. I mean, we collect qualitative data. We interview activists. But we don't go to activists and we're not like, hey, give us your data and we're going to analyze it for you. We don't do that. And that is a very conscious decision because the way that we enter this project is we think of ourselves as supporting their data science, their expert analysis, their contextual analysis, their process of data production. We don't enter as expert technical partners there to aggregate their data and be the experts about their data. And in fact, the activists themselves know far more about the nuances of feminicide and their media ecosystems and their own data than we would ever be able to know. So I just want to be clear about that. Okay, so the qualitative side of this is really the backbone. So we have, at this point, interviewed 41 groups across 18 countries, asking them, again, why do they monitor? Why do they do this work? What purpose does it serve for them? What is their definition of feminicide, their theory of change? Where do they get their information? We've learned some incredible things about the groups are incredibly resourceful about finding information in a deeply biased information ecosystem, and so on. That's the qualitative side. But I want to really kind of land on the design side. So our design process with data activists has been going in parallel with the qualitative interviews since we started, basically. As we started very small at the beginning, where we brought together Feminicidio Uruguay and Women Count USA at the very beginning of the project, to just say, are there opportunities in this space to build digital tools that might support and sustain the ongoing work of grassroots data science with these groups? So let's explore that possibility. And so from that, we did determine that there were many. In fact, we came up with lots of ideas in those workshops. We ended up building 2 of those tools. We piloted them with 7 groups, so 1 group of English-speaking groups, 1 group of Spanish-speaking groups in Argentina and Uruguay. And then recently, we've been doing somewhat the same work with groups in Brazil. So we launched our tools in English and Spanish, and then we've recently, in the past year, been doing workshops and pilots with groups in Brazil, and we've just launched this past summer the same tools in Portuguese. So I just want to explain a little bit about what we designed. So one tool is super simple, and one of the things that actually surprised students working on this project was that they said that I had an undergraduate remark to me at one point, is like, I didn't know a tool so simple could be so useful. Because we often think, especially in our elite institutions, that we have to be super complex and use the most advanced, cutting-edge techniques. When in fact, what might meet people's needs is something very, very simple. And so this is a browser extension. What it does is that it automatically, it's called the highlighter, automatically highlights names, places, dates, ages, and then custom words that a person might want. The use case for this is that much of the time what the activists are doing is they are reading digital news articles and they are scanning those for the relevant details to cut and paste into their databases. And so this serves this kind of very basic need, which is they can scan through a news article, pick out those things that might be most useful for them, and then be able to get through more articles and potentially a little bit less for this tool than the other ones. One of our design goals, I would say, which is a hard design goal, but one of our design goals was to try to think about how to reduce the emotional labor and the constant exposure to violence. And so this doesn't fully do that, but at least you might have to read a little bit less of the article and just get the details that you need for your database. Okay, and then the second tool that we built is significantly more complex. And how many people in this room have ever used Google Alerts? Yeah, most people. Okay, so this is the email alerts tool that we've built. It's basically Google Alerts, but for feminicide data activists. And so the goal here, whereas this article aids the activists once they have detected an article about feminicide and they've determined that they do want to read that article, it probably has useful information to them. This is for the stage of their workflow where they are trying to surface, they're trying to detect cases, and they're trying to surface what are the relevant news articles that most likely describe feminicide. And so what this does is that activists set up a project. The project monitors the media in a very specific geographic region. It could be at different scales, like either the state scale or the country scale. They configure their project. They have a query that will return a set of news articles that meet that query. But then behind the scenes, there's also an additional filtering stage, which is that we pass the articles through a machine learning classifier that tries to say with as much confidence as possible whether an article describes a feminicide or not. And those that pass that filtering threshold get delivered both in email and on our dashboard to activists for them to look at and for them to decide whether that meets their definition of feminicide. And then the one extra thing that we've done here, which we heard most activists had tried Google Alerts and it didn't work for a variety of reasons that I can go into further in Q&A or something. But one of the things that was most painful for them about working with Google Alerts was that they would receive an article multiple times, and they would receive a ton of articles about the same event. And so what we try to do here is we also try to group articles that are about the same case. And so that, again, to like streamline some of this work. And so again, like one of the high-level design goals here was to try to, we can't fully take away the emotional labor that these activists are going through. And in fact, we heard during the design process, they don't want us to do that. They actually told us they don't want this to be automated, even if that were technically possible, because for them, this work is about a kind of memory justice. It's about a kind of witnessing and caring and logging and kind of testimonial to lives that were lost unjustly, a kind of a refusal to forget. And so for them, the work is quite important. But they did want to reduce exposure to other violence, because when you put in a query about violence, many types of violence come back. So that to the extent that we could reduce learning about other kinds of violence or being exposed to other kinds of violence, that was sort of where we were going. This is a little bit more about, this is more the architecture, but just to say, if you're curious, where we get these global databases of news sources is from our partner, Media Cloud, which is a very large database of news articles that it itself is a kind of observatory. So it itself goes out and downloads, I think at this point it's like 40,000 different RSS feeds from many places from around the world. So they actually have a quite robust global database of news, and it's in fact much better than Google's. This is a reason too why Google Alerts didn't work, because Google doesn't have great media sources, particularly for the sort of hyper-local news sources that activists find most relevant, which have the most information for them. Okay, and yeah, so that's an example of how it arrives in their inbox. So there's both a dashboard and an email inbox view. Okay, so just to sort of reiterate, to underline these different stages of participation and design that we went through with activists, building a tool for us was not a foregone conclusion. We weren't like necessarily going to build something. So, the very first question is like, should we build anything, or is this a space where like we shouldn't build, and that's okay, right? Like we don't have to build something. So should we build anything? Then the question, if we decide yes, then the question becomes, what should we build? Then the question, especially once we got into the email alert system, which was a kind of relatively complex task, which I'm going to talk more in just a second about that, is sort of more about how do we incorporate activist language and their context into our machine learning models. And this was where participatory data annotation sessions with activists became really important. And we did this a little bit the first time around in English and Spanish, where we actually had activists labeling news articles for us so that we could train the machine learning model to basically think like an activist when labeling these articles. And it became even more important when we started working in the Brazilian context. And in fact, we spent about 6 months with Brazilian activists labeling articles, but also then coming together, very similar to what we do in a qualitative data analysis project, right? Where you code things, but then you come together because you realize that everybody codes things differently. So even amongst the activists working in Brazil, they largely agreed on the definition of feminicide, but like there's variation in that. And then there's also a ton of gray area when you're actually like looking at a news article. So even just for like a human, this is a very complex task, like looking at a news article and saying this, I would or I would not want to see this if I'm a feminicide data activist. So these became quite important. And then, following launches, how are the tools working for your group? So we had pilots. So then we had surveys and workshops to debrief about things that were coming up for them, things that we could fix, bugs, tuning features, and so on. And then there's ongoing support, and that's sort of where we're at right now. So some wins, some achievements, before I tell you about the bad stuff. Some wins, I'm really proud of this project. I think we've engaged in a really solid process, and I think we've been attuned to trying to think about how activists can benefit and get value from this project just as the participants are getting value and the students are learning and so on. So we've released the tools in 3 languages. We have 45 or so groups using our tools right now. We've co-authored a number of articles, and there's a recent one that came out in Portuguese with the Brazilian activists talking about the pilot we did with them. So we're trying to look for opportunities where we can co-publish and discuss publicly kind of like what's the value of this work, and also as a way to think about like what is this data activism about feminicide responding to. And then we continue to build a transnational community of practice by gathering together. And our next event is in November, if anyone is interested. But so even as I'm proud of what we've been able to accomplish, I do want to share tensions and pitfalls. And I share these not only because I want to be very transparent and truthful to you all. I want to tell you what happened for real. But also I think it's really important to model reflexivity. And what I mean by that is the ability to engage critically with our own work. So think through, what have we done? How did it work? What was our process like? What are the impacts like? And how does it fall short? It inevitably falls short in various ways. And I think like too often in academia and also in industry, we're incentivized towards what I would call hero stories. We're incentivized towards stories of success that look good for our institutions, they look good on our CV, they look good for promotion processes, and so on. And in particular, our institutions love to tell hero stories as well, right? They love to say how their professors or their students or their technologies saved some poor marginalized community from something or other, right? And I want us to be very skeptical of these stories. Because in fact, if we are letting our stories become co-opted in these ways, and if we ourselves are becoming the heroes of our design stories, then we are doing something wrong. So here I want to tell you about some tensions and frictions which are not resolved, and then just encourage you all to have the courage to resist hero stories in your own work. Okay, so our first tension is this. So feminicide itself is a politically contested concept. So this made it quite challenging for actually building a machine learning model that is going to label, give us a prediction about whether an article is describing a feminicide or not. People don't all agree. The laws on the books across various countries do not agree. Different states in Mexico do not agree with each other about the definition of feminicide. Activists don't agree with each other about what constitutes feminicide. So this kind of variation poses a really significant challenge for a technical system which is seeking to detect cases from news articles, right? Because one of the main benefits, we might say, from describing something computationally is that it centralizes and formalizes concepts into code. It makes things a little bit more rigid, right? There's a kind of definitional element there. But in the case of feminicide, across contexts and languages, this would be very premature. And so the way that we navigated this was by, again, not automating the feminicide recording. So like the email alerts tool surfaces possibly relevant cases as detected by the model, but it leaves it to the human judgment of the activists as to whether the case is truly relevant. And so in that way, we can support different definitions, different activists monitoring with different definitions. But we still have open questions about whether our machine learning models are open and flexible enough to detect cases that matter across contexts. And that's what this next tension is all about, in fact. And so one of the things that surfaced in our pilot, which is then the subject of subsequent work, was epitomized by this quote from one of our partners. It's not working for us. We are getting so many cases every day, but we check every single one, and none of them are Indigenous women. So one of the takeaways was that groups that were working with sort of all feminicides, groups that were monitoring all types of feminicide, were deriving far more utility from our tools than groups that were monitoring racialized feminicide, like missing and murdered Indigenous women. There are many reasons for this. There's systemic racialized media bias. There's racial misclassification. There's underreporting. This has been significantly demonstrated in media studies that cases about white women going missing or being murdered are far more reported in media than are cases of racialized women. So there's an underlying data problem there as well. And so the issue here is, how do we navigate the fact that the information ecosystem around gender-based violence is differently biased for different women? And so we realized our sort of default model of feminicide was not going to work in these cases, and then worked towards developing custom machine learning models for custom types of data collection. And so this is a tension we're still navigating. This part was led by Harini Suresh and Raj Mova for the most part. And so what they've written about, they developed basically a multi-stage way of training our machine learning classifier, where first they start with the kind of default cases, or our kind of initial model. Then they supplement with what they called context-specific positive, so the specific type of feminicide that the group was interested in. And then in round 3, they trained the model with context-specific negative. So these would be cases of, for example, if we're talking about black women killed in police violence, they would supplement with cases of black men killed in police violence to tell the model, we are not looking for these. We are looking, in fact, for women and not men. And so using these sort of more what they called context-specific models, we were able to get closer in our internal tests to what groups are looking to actually surface in their own data activism. But the test still remains. I think we've evaluated it internally and it works better now. The test still remains, I think, to deploy these models to the groups themselves and work on a participatory pilot to see if it's actually working for their needs. And then the final tension I want to raise before I wrap up is this one. It's a struggle for academic projects to create, support, and maintain tools that are useful in the real world. And I know many people share this. Many people, at least in HCI, I would say, share this struggle and have talked about it with many people. But a story that illustrates this is in January 2022. Our email alert system, we had launched it at one of our events. There were 40 groups using the system. They had made projects. And then the system went down. And the system went down because a key piece of our architecture, which is that Media Cloud database, the place where we were getting all of our global news articles from, the Media Cloud system went down. And so without a database of news to query against, of course, we're out. We can't function. But activists had come to rely on our tools at that point. And so this was really complicated. They were emailing us. So this is an email from one of the activists, hey, when are you guys going to get your stuff together? And so I think this illustrates, we've thought a lot about this. We've talked a lot about this. We did develop some redundancy in our data sources. We actually now have another data source other than Media Cloud. But I think it highlights some really systemic problems with this kind of building tools from academia position, right? So first of all, in academia, novelty is incentivized. So it's we have a lot more incentives in academia to make something new. We are not we don't get awards for good job maintaining your software. That's not an award that anybody gives out. This kind of systemic feature of the information, the climate we work in, leads to a kind of prototype proliferation, right? So we're always building prototypes. And then we're never necessarily designing useful tools and services. And I think it's like, imagine that industry will then pick up the stuff that research makes and put it into markets and so on. But as I highlighted at the beginning of the talk, there's problems with that model, right? Because then what we end up with, the things that are prioritized for scale, are those things which make money, and those things that put more power and money into the hands of people who already have power and money. So there's a kind of this is like, I would say, like an environmental challenge. This is an infrastructural challenge. Like, what do we do about this, So how do we think about how do we think about building tools from academia? Or if that's not the right question, how do we think about how to scale tools that get developed in academia, but in ways that are not just about accumulating wealth for billionaires? So I'm just sitting with this one. I have no answer for this one. So if anyone wants to talk about this in the Q&A, and I would love to hear how other labs and other folks who have built things have dealt with this, and think through, like, what are some creative ideas. So hopefully what this case study in participatory AI and ML has illustrated is that, well, we're able to, I think in our case, we were able to build a solid process. We developed 2 tools that I do think are providing value to numerous grassroots data science groups. But there's still these tensions. There's still these ethical dilemmas. I'm still asking myself some really hard questions. And I'm still not sure if, like, we should be doing this work even, And so I think this is also consistent with a long literature that also critiques participation. Like, there's a long tradition of participation, and there's also a long tradition of critiquing participation. And so I really like the title of this recent paper by Mona Sloan and colleagues here. They say participation is not a design fix for machine learning. So what they mean is, like, we can't just participation wash things, where it's like there's this problematic technology and you go do a couple user studies and you're like, everybody loves it, and then you put it out into the world, right? So there's all these ways in which a participatory process itself can be co-opted, and doesn't necessarily, participation is not by definition going to be emancipatory. We have to work really carefully, and we have to continue to think critically and carefully, even as we do these kinds of projects. It might not be a panacea, right? At the same time, avoiding participatory processes is also not the answer, at least in my opinion. So I think we just need to learn how to run them better and contribute to building real power at the margins in the process. Because ultimately, if what we care about is justice, then the work really needs to be about acknowledging and challenging these long histories of extraction, dispossession, and violence. If we do not challenge them, they stay in place. And that's largely what's happening, again, by default. It will be the default setting right now for technology. Okay, so that's basically the conclusion. I want to do a micro-justice action here. So in the process of writing my book, I talked with the activists themselves, and I said, hey, what are ways that I can share power with you? Because inevitably, as I write a book, I'm going to be going into the world and talking to folks like yourselves. And so together we came up with the idea of sort of highlighting one group at a time. And so today I just want to bring to your attention the group Sovereign Bodies Institute. They are based here in the United States. They're an incredible group that works on missing and murdered Indigenous women and people. A really visionary leader who is also a geography scholar, Anita Lucchese, if you want to look up her work. And I would just say take just a moment of your time, your attention, and if you have money, a tiny bit of money, and check out Sovereign Bodies. And then that's it. And look forward if we have a couple moments for questions. So thanks.
Great. We have a few minutes for questions. Professor Dignazio will also be joining us for lunch in 5 minutes at 12. So you can get to know answers to your questions or any background on this work then. But do folks have some questions for right now?
Maybe just a quick one, but it might be really hard to answer. I'm Hongting, by the way. I'm from South Wales. I'm really inspired by your work and the kind of really coherent and comprehensive way that you kind of think about design for grassroots organizations. How do you think about impact assessment in this space? Like, because there's so much. How do you even define success, and who gets to define success?
Yeah.
Projects, I'm curious to hear kind of your thoughts.
Yeah.
Given it's early on.
Yeah, I think it's so hard. I mean, so I will say one of the criteria for me, and so I think that it looks differently for different audiences, because like sometimes you have funders, for example, which require some kind of specific methodology of evaluating impact. I think for me, one of the ways that I evaluate success in terms of these kinds of partnerships is whether the groups and the people that we're working with want to stay in relationship with us. So like, and it doesn't have to be they have to be users necessarily of our tools, because we do more than make tools. It's more that staying in relationship and being a kind of ongoing collaborator, colleague, and so on. And so each time, like for example, when we're doing our annual events and people return, for me, that is incredibly meaningful, that they continue to show up, because, and for me, that means we're providing a space that is useful to them, you know? And so that is, I think, one powerful way. I'll say one of the things I resist, it was brought up when I was like workshop my book proposal with some colleagues, and one of the colleagues, who I actually really like, and I won't say his name, but I got irritated with his comment because he wanted to impose a kind of evaluation mechanism on the data activism of these groups to look at had their data led to policy change. And I don't feel, at least the way that from my positionality, entered this work, I don't feel like it's my role to evaluate them. Does that make sense? Like, I'm not entering to be like, did you do a good job, data activist? Like, I'm entering and I'm assuming that they do this work because it's important and meaningful and it's having an impact. And in fact, like, I think a lot of what my book is about is the ways in which it's having an impact that exceed policy change. Policy change is important, and many of the groups that are doing this work do want to change policy. Not all of them, but many do. But then many of the things that groups do with their data, I didn't really focus on that as much in this talk, but they also circulate their data in a variety of ways to challenge mainstream framings of gender-related violence, so to challenge the idea that it's like an individual perpetrator and an individual victim, and to say, no, hey, we need to consider this in a more structural context. They use their data in many cases for providing direct services. So often these are groups that are doing services in the community. Like, they are actively trying to prevent gender-based violence. They are helping families. Many groups accompany families through the justice system. And so a lot of what their data does is actually inform the delivery of those services. And then protests. So many groups use their data in these tremendously creative, sort of artistic ways for protest. And so, like, that's where I, again, I'm a little bit skeptical of like narratives where we could like be like, oh, their work is only successful if it's led to like this very specific policy change. And then that said, like, there are examples of where that happened. Like in Puerto Rico, the whole chapter 2 of my book is about Puerto Rico, because the group's work actually did lead to passage of a very specific law, which is pretty incredible in my opinion. So yeah, but I would just say it's complicated. And the other reason it's complicated is because these projects are complicated. Like, we have, as you saw, kind of these multiple parts. So it's like, at which point, when we're talking about, like, for ourselves evaluating a part of the project, like, which part are we evaluating and for whom? We have to kind of think about that carefully. Yeah.
One more quick.
Yeah, I also have a question.
Okay.
This is in relation to reflexibility and like how we view positionality in our work, because I feel that from kind of conversations related to working with marginalized populations, as a white person, like, this feels not your place to intervene.
Yeah.
So I know that as a person who's been thinking through a whole pipeline or process, how do you view your identity when you're even tackling these?
Sure. 100%. I think those are super important questions, and it's one of the reasons I told you all very specifically that we don't collect activist data. Like that was like a very specific choice that we made, where the way, again, like the position that we enter in is we came in as a little group of organizers or whatever, and we said we basically have some organizational ability, like we can pull people together, we can build digital tools, but we're not here to do their job better than them. And so I think that's where sometimes academic projects collaborating can go wrong, because sometimes as academics we enter with this idea that we are experts, right? And that in some ways that the marginalized community is somehow deficient, and we're going to provide our expertise to supplement them. And I think we enter very differently. So in this case, like we enter with this idea that activists are they're their own experts. Like if you talk to any of them, they have powerful theories, theoretical formulations of like why gender-related violence is happening in their context. They have all the data that they've been analyzing and like empirically reviewing to sort of supplement those arguments. And then they're deep experts in the media ecosystems in their particular context. So I think it's sort of like it's not to say that like from a specific positionality we can't enter a space. It's that we need to be sensitive to the baggage that we might bring, particularly when we come from dominant groups, white, elite, rich, global north, male sort of positionalities, that like we need to be sensitive to the ways in which we bring the hubris that we've inherited from being cultivated in these kinds of institutions, and try as much as possible to leave that aside and work on supporting visions that the community groups themselves have articulated. And I think that's what's important, is like we don't bring the vision, we bring a certain level of like design support, we can build some community infrastructure and some social infrastructure in this space, we can create spaces for people to come together, but we would never enter and be like, oh, like we can do your work better than you, or we're going to synthesize all your data and make a report about it and then make ourselves the center of like global research about the topic or something, right? But it's one of the reasons like I included this too, because these are really, they're very real concerns on my mind of like, who want like all the power and social capital in this space to be sucked up by Catherine D'Ignazio, if that makes sense. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Can we show our appreciation one more time?